Good evening and welcome to this Forum for Philosophy event on the modern mind. Because of COVID-19, we're still working remotely, so thank you so much for joining us online for this panel discussion. Welcome from this nursery/home office in Dublin to you wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. Our topic this evening is the modern mind. The philosophy of mind is naturally a centerpiece of philosophy, philosophical thought and education, and long has been. Tonight, we're trading on the ambiguity in the term modern to allow for a discussion of the mind that begins with early modern polymath Descartes and traces the trajectory of thought through the ideas of Charles Darwin and evolutionary thinking, right up to the contemporary moment in philosophy of cognitive science, where we find ideas like virtual reality and embodied cognition. With us to discuss these ideas are our panelists, who are Adrian Alsmith, a lecturer in philosophy at King's College London, Tim Lewens, Professor of Philosophy of Science at Cambridge University, and Slater, Associate Tutor at Birkbeck University and founder of the London Cartesian Circle. My name is Clare Moriarty. I'm a philosopher working at Trinity College Dublin, and I'm a fellow of the Forum. This event is co-sponsored by the Royal Institute of Philosophy and by the British Society for the History of Philosophy, so a big thanks to them for that. The format for the event will be as follows. We'll have about 50 to 55 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists and about 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. There are two ways to ask questions in the discussion, so they depend on what way you're watching the event. If you're watching us on Zoom, you can use the Q&A functionality that you can hopefully see on your screen now and just drop a question in there. And then if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can just pop a question into the comments and we'll get to as many of them as we can towards the end of the event. So, Lauren, I'm going to come to you first. Why begin this discussion of the modern idea of the mind with Descartes? What's so distinctive about him as a thinker in that way?
Yes, I think this is a really great question. And I guess my answer to it is that Descartes' view is kind of our intuitive view, I think. And it's certainly a view that's kind of embedded in our language. So anybody who knows anything about Descartes will know that Descartes made a distinction between the mind and the body. So the mind is sort of the thinking part of the human being, the body, the physical part of the human being. And I think if we think about sort of sayings that we have, like mind over matter, all of these sorts of things that we say do seem to kind of presuppose this sort of view that we're kind of things that have bodies. Even just saying, you know, my body is something that sort of seems to presuppose this kind of dualist idea. And so I think it's kind of an intuitive starting point.
So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what is so distinctive about this kind of theory, and what is Cartesian dualism? I know it's a huge question for not that long an event, but can you give us either a reminder or an introduction to his way of thinking about these things?
Yeah. So I guess maybe it's good to sort of tell the story that Descartes tells. So Descartes begins his most famous work, the Meditations, with this project of doubt. What he's trying to do is he's trying to work out what it is that we can know for certain. And so he goes through these kind of levels of doubt. First of all, he doubts what it is that we get from our senses. So he sort of says, well, we can be wrong about things that we perceive. Like when you're looking at something that's very far away, you might think that it looks round, but when in fact it's square. Then he talks about the dreaming doubt, the idea that we might be in a dream and that would be sort of indistinguishable from reality, or what we take to be reality. And then he introduces the big player, the evil demon who can deceive us. He sort of says that there's this, or he entertains the possibility that there could be this all-powerful deceiver who deceives us about even sort of seemingly certain mathematical truths like 2 + 3 = 5. So he's doubting everything. He's sort of thinking, like, I can call everything into question that I've taken to be certain. And then he gets to this kind of bedrock, which is the idea that, well, if I'm doubting, if I'm sitting here doubting that all these things exist, that all these things sort of really exist, then there's something doubting, there's something thinking, and that's something that you can't be deceived about, because if you're being deceived, there's something being deceived, right? So there's something doing the thinking, and that really is what Descartes takes the mind to be. It's thinking, it's thought. He says that something that wills, affirms, denies, has sensory perceptions, imagines, has memory. This is the thinking part of us. And so that really is the kind of the Cartesian mind. It's that thought, and that's what he takes to be the thing that we can be absolutely certain that exists, that we exist as thinking things. Of course, later on he comes to sort of build back up, and of course he thinks that he comes back to bodies and the idea of bodies, and of course bodies exist too. He takes the human being to be a union between the mind and the body. So that's what we are as human beings. So we're thinking things that are united, intermingled with these physical bodies. So that's his account of the mind in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. It's a difficult task. And what kind of things motivate Descartes' take here? You've told us a little bit about how it's such a powerful idea and how it figures in the account in the Meditations, but is it a kind of coming from a religious point of view? Is he trying to do scientific epistemology? What's going on when he sort of is telling us this is how it is?
Yeah, so I guess there are, Descartes was a religious man, and God is definitely a part of his philosophical account of things, and there was some concern to think about questions concerning the afterlife. So thinking about the way that the mind or the soul continues after the death of the body was something that he was concerned about. But I do think that if Descartes were around right now, I think that we would probably, if we look at his sort of corpus as a whole, we'd probably describe him as a scientist rather than a philosopher. I think, we get this bit of philosophy in the Meditations that I've just described, this sort of project of doubt and working out what it is that we can know for certain. That's sort of very distinctively philosophical. But if we take his works as a whole, he writes, a lot of mathematics. So a lot of the mathematics that you will have likely learned in school come from Descartes. But he also writes a great deal about sort of science topics that we would now call scientific. And yeah, I think that the human being as a kind of subject that he wanted to learn about really was his project. What he wanted to do was understand human beings as these mind-body unions, and that involved a great deal of what we would now call science. So it's a little bit of both, I think.
So it's probably quite unfair to Descartes that he's one of the first things that students of philosophy learn in an undergraduate philosophy degree, and probably one of the first Meditations is one of the first texts that students really have a go at trying to skewer in their exam questions. So the famous one that everyone seems to remember are problems with the mind being able to cause things to happen in the body. So could you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe whether you feel it's fair to think he's finished on the basis of those kind of worries?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do often, I think, with undergraduate courses, sort of intro to philosophy of mind courses, we get this sort of caricature of Descartes' view, where we have this dualism set up, where you have the mind and the body as these completely distinct substances that share nothing in common. And then the question is, well, when I think about raising my arm raises. So how do you explain that? That sort of seems like something that begins in my mind and ends with my body. Or likewise, the vision, for example, involves my eyes, but then I have these sort of visual ideas. I have, ideas of colors and so on. So how is it that these two really distinct things that share nothing in common interact? I don't think that it's not a problem. So I'm not going to try and sort of solve the mind-body problem right here and right now.
Fair enough. You don't have long.
Yeah, I don't have long enough to do that. I'm working on it though, so stay tuned. So I guess, these problems are problems, but I think that that kind of, I suppose that these problems don't seem to be sort of Descartes' central concern. So perhaps it's sort of a bit unfair to just sort of set up this view and then immediately kind of shoot him down. And often I do think that there's some sort of oversimplification that takes place when we're first introduced to Descartes' philosophy. One very brief thing I can say, I guess, is that I think in sort of contemporary philosophical debates, there's been this progression towards thinking about causation as a single notion. So as being kind of one kind of relation. So you've got this cause and effect relation, and that's just sort of one thing. There's one kind of thing that's a cause. And actually, I think that if you look at the history of philosophy, that's not really true. So famously, you've got Aristotle had 4 kinds of cause. The Stoics had like 100 kinds of cause. The medieval thinkers, again, had many different kinds of causes that they conceived. And Descartes as well talks about more than one kind of cause. And I think that that is something that sort of is quite a simple point, but does often not get mentioned in these sorts of debates. So yes, while we can say maybe straightforward, sort of efficient, as Descartes would say, efficient causation can't take place between the mind and the body, but that's not to say that there isn't a species of causal relation between the mind and the body. So yeah, there's definitely kind of detail there that ought to be included.
Okay, so maybe Descartes can help himself to some sort of pluralism around causation and try and find a way to wriggle free of what looks like an objection to just one kind of causation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he just thinks it's just a different kind of relation. So he sort of thinks, well, we understand these kinds of causes in one way, but we should understand this kind of cause in just a different way. So for him, it's not a massive problem, or I think, he doesn't seem to see it as like a huge insurmountable problem.
Okay, well, thank you so much for such a great summary under pressure. And we might move to Tim now, just to sort of bring out the ideas of one of the other big thinkers we're interested in. So Charles Darwin, very famous guy, a lot of work on evolution. But did you think much about the mind, Tim? Is that something we see him talking about a lot?
Fortunately for us this evening, he did think about the mind.
Wonderful.
It would be a bit of a shame if the answer to that question was no, wouldn't it? Yeah, so I mean, obviously, a lot of Darwin's work doesn't concern the mind, at least not directly. So he wrote whole books on orchids, on earthworms. He wrote about things that aren't even living. So he wrote on the formation of coral reefs. There's not much on the mind in The Origin of Species either. But you do see the mind as a pretty consistent concern of Darwin's right through his working life, really. So he gets very excited early on in London, well before The Origin of Species was written, about maybe there being a lot of potential in a kind of evolutionary view for our ability to understand the mind. I just mentioned that he doesn't talk about the mind very much in The Origin of Species, but he lays out this very pregnant promissory note where he says, I think in the future, there's going to be a wonderful scope for research based on the idea that all psychological faculties are acquired by gradation from earlier ancestors. So we might have to take a gradualist approach to the development of the mind itself. You then get a real sort of dedicated patch of work on the mind quite a long time after the publication of The Origin of Species. So The Origin of Species comes out in 1859. In 1871, he publishes The Descent of Man. And in that book, Darwin is particularly concerned to try to understand one aspect of our thinking, what he calls the moral sense. So the idea that we have a psychological ability to discern right from wrong, or at least we think we can discern right from wrong. And then you get a whole book devoted to emotional expression in humans and other animals.
Can you tell us a bit about that? That sounds great.
Yeah, so I mean that's an interesting. There's a lot to say about that book. I mean it's interesting partly because of how extremely un-Darwinian the book is in some ways. So so for example, on the back cover blurb of my edition of The Expression of Emotions, there's a puff from Richard Dawkins where he gets very excited and he says, this has been tremendously influential, long predates Freud and will be continuing to illuminate psychology even after Freud's been dead and buried and forgotten. But while Dawkins is of course known for being a real enthusiast for the explanatory power of natural selection is barely mentioned at all anywhere in The Expression of Emotions. And actually, although Darwin sees human emotional expression as having its roots in earlier animal ancestors, and he draws all of these parallels between expression of emotions in humans and expression of emotions in other animals, he doesn't actually credit it to the operation of natural selection. He thinks something much more like what we now think of as a Lamarckian form of inheritance is involved there. So it's a—
Do you mind explaining what that is, just
sure.
for me?
So so the idea roughly, so Darwin thought that habits which might initially be consciously performed in animals and also in humans would eventually express themselves automatically in offspring. And these are ideas that people would very rarely give any credit to now. But, you know, Darwin thought that if the blacksmith consciously spends his life bashing away at the forge, then actually that habit will result in the blacksmith's kids getting big muscles pretty much for free in future generations. So this is what Darwin calls use inheritance sometimes, and we now think of as being associated with Lamarck. But it's a Darwinian idea too, and gets a lot of credit in the expression of emotions.
So I suppose one of the things we think of Darwin as doing, well, I do, and I don't know him well, but is bringing sort of humans and animals a little bit closer together in the way we think about their development and their behaviors. Do we see similarities in, I mean, for Darwin, are emotions similar in human beings and other creatures?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that's really important right through Darwin's work. So, you know, for Darwin, obviously, all species are descended from maybe just a very few ancestors in common, maybe just one, he's not quite sure, but he sees life as having this great tree-like structure. And so it's important for him to show continuity at all points between the different twigs or the different branches on that tree. And so that means that Darwin doesn't think of, well, in some ways, he doesn't think of the human mind as anything special. He thinks that all organisms pretty much have some form of mentality. There are certain points really late in his career when he even starts flirting with the idea that you can think of the roots of plants in the way that they sense sources of nutrients or sources of water as having a kind of quasi-consciousness, a kind of quasi-mentality. So he sees mentality as distributed kind of throughout the evolutionary tree. In terms of emotional expression, he absolutely thinks that, you know, why is it that your hairs stand on end when you're scared? Well, he thinks that this probably owes itself to earlier ancestors puffing themselves up, either their feathers or their fur, puffing those up to make themselves look bigger and therefore more fierce in the face of a foe. So he thinks that you can understand human emotional expression as inherited from a common ancestor. And that's why he thinks that fear in humans has all of these kind of isomorphisms, has all of these similarities with, you know, let's say fear in dogs or other creatures. So in some ways, humans are nothing special. At the same time, Darwin's pretty clear that although all creatures have some form of mentality, he's nonetheless very clear that humans kind of have it to a degree that's far developed beyond anybody else. And particularly the person with it the most developed is usually Isaac Newton, as far as Darwin goes.
Okay, smart lad. We will have to allow that. It seems like that already poses a real contrast with at least my understanding of Descartes, which is that humans are super special, right, Lauren? Is that, I mean, I'm sort of interested to know from both of you, do you see a kind of line of negative influence here? Like, would Darwin have been responding in any sort of way to Descartes' idea that, I think, did Descartes, is that correct, that Descartes didn't really think animals thought in a proper sense?
Yeah, so I guess that's another thing that is perhaps a sort of slight oversimplification. He did sort of attribute a great deal of capacities to bodies. So he talks about imagination and memory and sensory perception and even passion and emotion as something that is body involving, and therefore there's a kind of bodily component that animals have. He also had a dog called Mr. Scratch, which I love. I just think it's funny that he has such a sort of human name for his dog. I just like that little fact. But yes, it's true that human beings are something special in that we have these minds that animals don't have. Yeah, for him.
Tim, is there any kind of recognition of that sort of contrast, or?
I don't know if Darwin's, I mean, I can't think of any evidence that Darwin is specifically kind of responding to Descartes. On the other hand, Darwin, I think, was quite influenced by the sort of British empiricist tradition. So Darwin's certainly not the first person to suggest that in some way or another, the mentality of humans and animals is built on very similar foundations. You get that idea very much in Hume, for example, as well. And Darwin read Hume, and I think was quite influenced by Hume. The difference with Darwin really is not so much that nobody else has ever thought to posit these similarities, but that Darwin gives an explanation for why there should be those similarities in terms of inheritance from common ancestors.
Okay, that seems really powerful. And then just maybe before we get to Adrian, I was wondering, does sort of Darwin spark then a new way of thinking? Do we see a kind of trajectory of thought coming out of Darwin's approach to the mind that is sort of popular after that, or?
Yeah, Darwin's legacy is really complicated, partly because Darwin has a style of writing that often brings in all kinds of different, very eclectic themes and modes of explanation, which means that lots of different people get influenced by lots of different aspects of his thinking. But I mean, just to kind of throw out a few examples, very, very soon after Darwin's death, there's an effort by people like George Romanes to sketch out this so-called comparative vision of psychology, whereby you think of mental faculties of the whole kind of tree of life as being descended from common ancestors. And Romanes really tries to do that sort of sketching in quite a lot of detail. Much later, actually Darwin's work on expression of emotions really gets kind of revived, overhauled and endorsed, albeit with much better methods, by people like Paul Ekman, writing as late as the 1970s. So there is this kind of rediscovery of Darwin's work later on. There's a kind of period as well when people sort of go off Darwin a bit, because actually, similar to what Lauren was just saying, Darwin was completely obsessed by dogs, owned many dogs through his life. And because of his gradualist commitment, in other words, because of the idea that he sees because he sees mental faculties as being gradually modified from common ancestors, he's really, really keen to see quite sophisticated mental capacities in other creatures. So he'll talk about apes feeling shame, he'll talk about sheep being embarrassed and so forth. And you get this turn against that in the sort of kind of mid part of the 20th century, where psychologists think, oh, if we're going to get serious about doing our job, we'd better not throw out these mental attributions too liberally. Maybe we should sort of rein in the attributions of kind of complex forms of thought until we really feel as though we've got decisive evidence. So they would think of Darwin as in some ways being a bit too trigger happy in terms of attributing mental states to other creatures.
Okay, so a good reminder that important thought often comes with a proper phase of backlash. Adrian, so we've done a bit of a leap from Descartes to Darwin and now another leap. Could you tell us a bit about cognitive science, especially maybe any role for dogs in it, given the strength of that so far? But yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what cognitive science is and how it approaches questions of the mind?
Right, yeah, so I think that cognitive science, the very idea of cognitive science, is an interesting entry point for the contemporary study of the mind for many reasons. One of which is that it captures a rather federal contemporary relationship between the many different disciplines that study the mind. So cognitive science, to actually answer your question, is an umbrella term for the multidisciplinary study of the mind. So under the umbrella, you find psychology, neuroscience, computer science, anthropology, evolutionary biology, as well as philosophy. And although they can all be loosely characterized as having a common subject matter, people working in each of these disciplines use very different methods and have largely interdisciplinary concerns within their disciplines that are bound up with more specific research aims. So if you contrast this, right, with with earlier historical periods, such as Descartes, where insofar as there are different ways of studying the mind, they're all conceived of as within the domain of philosophy. So experimental psychology, for instance, only emerged as a distinct discipline in the 19th century, way after Descartes' time, right? But to kind of continue the early line of thought, the early history of cognitive science is, I think, a period in which people are developing a reaction to a pattern of thinking in psychology, which has, I think, some very kind of interesting Cartesian themes. But I don't know if I'm making too much of one answer to the first question.
No, I mean, please feel free to expand on that. So do you think there's a reactionary thread in the kind of emergence of a cognitive science approach to the mind? Like, what would it be reacting to there?
Well, so I guess the background is that that as cognitive science was emerging, it was emerging in reaction to behavioristic psychology. So behavioristic psychology restricted itself, had these methodological principles that restricted itself to examining the relationship between strictly observable kind of facts and events. So observable stimuli and observable behavioral responses were the kind of focus of psychology. And so talk of unobservables, such as conscious experiences and thoughts and beliefs and desires, were kind of banished from scientific discussion. But I guess by the late 50s, there was a kind of a very different intellectual trend emerging, where it seemed like there was a range of evidence that seemed to require extensive theorizing about some kind of internal, if you like, unobservable structures that cause us to behave in the ways that we do. And so I guess let me just kind of bring out the Cartesian themes that develop from even kind of this basic idea that we need to focus on the, as it were, the kind of inner causes of behavior. So there was really a theme that emerged across psychology, computer science, and also philosophy that is kind of loosely characterized by the idea of the mind as an information processor that's in the business of constructing and storing information in internal structures called representations, which carry information about the world, and that the core function of the mind is to be a general purpose device for the construction and deployment of accurate representations. And so kind of this brings me to the Cartesian theme that I was kind of interested to get on the table, which is that these representations fit very well the role of I guess what Descartes would call ideas. So there are, of course, major differences that I'll leave to others, like perhaps Lauren, to point out. But just to emphasize a kind of interesting thematic similarity, which is that in these kind of early, slightly reactionary days, cognitive science was proposing an explanation of the mind in terms of structures and entities that were fundamentally separate from the world. So if our explanations of the mind ought to focus on internal representations, which, as it were, kind of stand in for the worldly objects and events that we experience and think about and act upon, then looking at the world in understanding the mind is looking in the wrong place. You need to look at how it's represented, right? You need to look at kind of what's going on within the mind. So that's a kind of broadly Cartesian theme. And another theme is that the mind is to be understood in terms of these internal structures, then it seems, at least it seemed to many, that these structures were an abstraction away from the biological stuff in which they might be implemented. So one way in which this idea has been developed is to think of the mind as the software of the brain. So just as we can think of computational processes such as algorithms without studying the machines that will implement them, kind of machines that we're using now, right? So models of psychological processes can be studied without too much concern for neurobiological details. And this I think fits well with the contrast between Descartes' work on the relationship between kind of the domains of science of the day, right? So he saw, I think it's right to say that he saw biological mechanisms as just a certain kind of physical mechanism, right? And in that sense, biology would be reducible to physics. But he thought we needed a rather different form of explanation for psychology. So this idea of the mind being a very separate domain of explanation is a kind of another, as it were, Cartesian theme.
Also, just to remind the other speakers, feel free to interject at any point as well. So it seems like we have, like, with Descartes, we've got the mind very much as a sort of spiritual substance, or to be understood that way, and then a movement to biology, and it sounds like cognitive science, or at least a certain strand of it, is interested in functional, algorithmic, kind of a sort of more abstracted process. Is that something that's still popular now, or are we moved on again in terms of trends and themes?
Well, I think that there's a very complicated intersection of these ideas these days. So there's, if you think about it as there being kind of, as it were, two sorts of dichotomies, this mind-world dichotomy and a mental-physical dichotomy. These both being, as it were, kind of broadly Cartesian dichotomies. Then there are proponents and opponents of both of these ideas, right? So if you think about, say, just the mental physical dichotomy, an idea that's been developed during the course of the 20th century, and it's a very familiar idea these days, is the idea that, well, the mind is just the brain, right? And this idea of the mind being an abstraction from the stuff in which it's implemented is in tension with the idea that mental states just are brain states. So a major source of contention within philosophy, but also within cognitive science more broadly, is just the relationship between, as it were, psychology and neuroscience, or whether it is true that mental states just are brain states. But even if, say, it's right that mental states just are brain states, if we are still appealing to some idea of representation in understanding what characterizes mental processes, that still leaves open the possibility of this other sort of Cartesian dichotomy, right, between the mind and the world. So there's a different sort of debate that you find amongst philosophers, but also amongst others, as to whether we need to think about more than just the brain in thinking about mental processes. Maybe we need to, as many propose, we need to think about mental processes as complexes of subtle relationships between the brain, the body, and our local environment, and in doing so, think about the brain as just one part of a broader system that characterizes the interesting psychological capacities that we have.
I feel like that's really interesting to raise, because I think it will allow maybe a thread through the previous thinkers as well. I mean, I'd just like to invite the others to comment a bit on the role of mind versus brain, or how to think about the relationship between what we sort of conventionally call the mind and brain in previous.
Well, I can think of one relationship that's maybe interesting there, in that so if you think of explaining everything to do with the mind just in terms of neural structures, there's a kind of unit of explanation that's your kind of common currency in all your psychological explanations. And there seems to be something similar with thinking about the gene or kind of selection processes acting on genetic material as your unit of explanation that's common currency. But I don't know if that's a really superficial similarity.
No, that's very, very helpful. Also, I'd just like to remind the audience that they're free to ask questions. So on Facebook Live and in the Q&A bit of Zoom. Lauren, Tim, this kind of issue of the mind versus the brain, is that something we see represented in your areas?
Shall I just chip in and say a bit about Darwin here? So
sure.
Darwin doesn't pretend to be a philosopher, even though he's very interested in philosophy. And so when these questions get really metaphysical, Darwin's tendency is usually just to hedge. So he says things like the mind is a function of the brain, leaving it a bit unclear whether that means the mind just is the brain, or whether maybe how the mind works depends in some way on how the brain works. He certainly thinks they're intimately linked. But he does say some quite interesting things in passing. So at one point he says, why is it that we find the idea that thought is a secretion of the brain so much more puzzling than the idea that gravity is a secretion of matter, right? I mean, so in other words, what he's saying is, why are we so determined to find this weird at all? Why don't we go around saying, oh, how come gravity is a thing? You know, how come massive objects exert gravity? Isn't that weird? He says, well, we don't think it's weird. We just think it's how things are built. And so why do we think that there's this, incredibly puzzling problem about why it is that brains should end up producing this thing called thought? And at that point, he says, this actually goes back to the very first question you asked me, I think, Clay. He basically says, maybe it's just arrogance. Maybe it's just that because we do the thinking, we're determined to think of thinking as especially weird and puzzling in a way that we don't grasp other things. Yeah. He has some things to say about this, but not all that much, because most of the time he's focused on trying to grab the problems that he thinks of as tractable and working with those, and sort of leaving the metaphysics to others.
Yeah.
That's student of Hume. Oh, sorry, go on, Lauren.
I was just going to say, that's interesting. Maybe Darwin did read Descartes, because that gravity example is one that Descartes himself uses in his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, when she's sort of saying, she's posing this question, right, of the problem of the interaction between the mind and the body. And he says, he sort of calls on this sort of Aristotelian idea of gravity, which he doesn't agree with. He says it's the wrong idea of gravity, but if it helps you to think of it, think about the way that sort of gravity, which is this immaterial sort of thing, it's this, well, it's sort of this thing that we can conceive of, kind of pushes things down or pulls things down towards the earth. If you want to think of the relationship between the mind and the body like that, then that's sort of maybe close. That's a kind of example that he gives. So that's interesting.
On the issue of the brain, dare I mention the two dreaded words of pineal gland? I'm sure too much has been made of it, but do you want to discuss it?
I will say something about the pineal gland, because the reason, so yes, of course, the brain, Descartes recognizes that the brain is of central importance, right? And he calls the brain the seat of the soul. So he recognizes that the brain is sort of very heavily involved in our sort of in our capacities, our various mental capacities. But the reason that he thought that the pineal gland was important is it's not a stupid reason, given that he was writing when he was, and the kind of access to information that he had, he thought that the pineal gland was important because it's the only part of the brain that he could identify that isn't duplicated, that doesn't have another side. And so he thought, since we have sort of united perception, since we sort of have one conscious experience, that's this united experience, even though we have two ears and two eyes and so on, that little bit of the brain must be important because it's the only bit of the brain that's not a double. So not a crazy reason.
Well, that's really helpful. I'd never heard that before. So
yeah. There you go.
Adrian, I was wondering about, so there's the understanding of body and self-consciousness seems to also be important to the way current theorists are engaging with questions on the mind. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in lots of different ways, but one way that follows on maybe interestingly from the tendency to wonder actually what is special about thinking about the mind, is that perhaps Descartes is exploiting in some places the flexibility of our mental concepts, and especially of our conception of ourselves, that we're able to think of ourselves as radically different entities, but yet kind of one and the same thing. So I can think of myself as just under 6 foot tall, and think of myself greeting my mother in the hereafter, right? And think of in heaven, say, and in doing so, I'm referring to one and the same thing, but as I do so, I'm referring to radically different kinds of entity, right? And so what a lot of work on self-consciousness recently is grappling with is both the centrality of this kind of flexibility of our self-conception seems to be, but also the ways in which our experience of the body and the ways in which our experience of the environment seem to present this body as ourselves. And so a kind of interesting relationship between these two is being able to, as it were, present bodily structures or kind of bodily like entities and have people refer to them as themselves. So using just say kind of props like rubber hands, or using virtual avatars, and having these avatars synchronize with our movements in various ways, people seem compelled to certainly act as if the avatars were themselves, and respond to questionnaire statements as if they were themselves. And so some people, especially in psychology and neuroscience, see this as a way of studying self-consciousness that both captures the centrality of the body in self-consciousness, but also captures the kind of fits with what I was characterizing as a kind of broad Cartesian theme, which was that that which we represent as ourselves, we take to be ourselves. I think that there's some kind of slightly mistaken moves in that kind of line of thought, but you can see how it fits. Well, hopefully, if I've been clear enough, with both this idea of us having a flexible self-conception, but also this idea of us being in the business of representing things in being psychological creatures.
Oh, I mean, that flexible self-conception point really reminded me of death. And it seems to be important to a lot of thinking about the mind, that it might be the kind of thing that can survive death. And I'm just wondering if anyone would like to sort of say a bit about what role that plays in their thinking about it, or their chosen philosophers thinking about it.
Yeah.
Since there's,
Go ahead, Tim.
well, I was going to say, since there's silence, one of the slightly odd things about Darwin's work is that he doesn't seem to be bothered by death at all. And there are sort of various suggestions as to why. Maybe he's got some sort of strange materialist resurrectionist attitude at certain points. Generally, Darwin has this sort of gradual waning of any kind of religious view over the course of his life. So he starts off thinking he's going to train to be an Anglican priest, and then he sort of goes off Anglicanism, and then he goes off Christianity, and then he goes off any kind of monotheism, and then he goes off theism altogether. And in the end, he sort of peters out in this sort of slightly depressive agnosticism that involves saying, well, I just think we're just fumbling around. There's no sense in humans really reflecting very much at all about creation or the afterlife. He says that's a bit like a gorilla trying to think about Euclid. So he just thinks it's kind of beyond us. He's not an atheist, or he doesn't think of himself as an atheist anyway. But it's odd, though, that he seems to be this sort of strange kind of skeptical attitude that he had. Well, maybe not a strange attitude, but this sort of skeptical notion of one's own limitations and even thinking about these things seems to leave him in a curiously sort of peaceful position, actually, at the end.
Makes sense. Lauren, I take it Descartes' mind is in heaven, right?
Yeah. Although I think there is a kind of, it's a funny thing to think about. So one distinction, so I'll talk about angels. Descartes mentions angels, and for him, he thinks of angels as these pure intellects. So there's a difference between us and the angels in that we are, right now at least, we're embodied minds. And he talks about, he describes that intermingling, the fact that this embodied state as not being like a sort of a sailor in a ship where you just kind of, observe your body, but you're kind of intimately intermingled with it, intimately united with it. And I think, the comparison between us then and the angels, an angel would sort of have a relation to a body where it was one of sort of pure observation, and wouldn't, for example, have sensory perceptions, wouldn't have imagination, memory, passions, emotions, all of these things that Descartes attributes to the union of mind and body. And so the experience of a soul or a pure intellect is going to be one that's it's unimaginable, sort of by definition, because you can't imagine it. It's sort of a weird one to think about. I mean, I suppose, maybe the angels are just sort of up there contemplating their clear and distinct ideas of mathematics. Maybe heaven is just a bunch of intellects thinking about maths. I sort of think that might be Descartes' heaven, which just, it doesn't sound too bad. I suppose it's fine. The other thing that I think is true for Descartes, he was very, especially towards the end of his life, he was very preoccupied with the health of the body and sort of preserving an embodied life. So he himself was quite sickly as a child, and he later had a daughter who died in infancy. And I think that those sort of personal experiences sort of impacted his thinking, and actually, meant that he was especially interested in illness and making sure that we can preserve ourselves for as long as possible. So that's another thing I'll say about sort of perhaps death avoidance.
Kind of sad given the end he did meet. So just a tenuous sort of segue here from things people might see as spooky, like angels and evil demons, to virtual reality. Adrian, can you tell us a little bit about sort of virtual reality simulation? It seems like the popular conception of philosophy of mind, or maybe some sort of cognitive science treatments of mind these days, is that sort of cool tech ideas can play a helpful role?
Well, I suppose. This is as much an idea of science fiction as actual kind of present day technology. So the Matrix being, as it were, the implementation of the evil demon's world created for the poor Cartesian subject. But I guess it kind of fits with a popular conception of virtual reality as aiming towards creating the perfect illusion that matches in every possible way the patterning of stimulation that our actual environment would provide for us, and that would act in just the same ways, or kind of show just the same effects of our behavior as our interactions with our actual environments. But real virtual reality systems aren't anywhere near that sort of standard, and they tend to be restricted to one sort of modality display, just vision, say. And it might be better, especially given the role of the actual content of the simulation, to think of virtual reality much more in terms of what the subject experiencing the virtual reality is bringing to the situation, and see it more along the lines of an experience of fiction, say, where you employ your capacity to imagine various scenarios as plausible and mesh your perception of what fits this imaginative content to create some very rich experience of a plausible virtual world. So that's, I think, the right way of seeing virtual reality experience, if I may put that on the table. But it doesn't fit as well with the evil demon, unless the evil demon is toying with your imagination as well as other things.
Well, you can imagine that it would. I might at this point move on to questions, because there are absolutely loads. So I'll read out some of the questions, and just please jump in as you see fit. So one question here says, Carlos, I think it's used to say, so mind-body dualism seems to be universal. What could be the reason why all humans need always to think of themselves as something beyond their bodies? Is there an adaptive value to it? So the sort of kind of universality of dualist instincts.
Yeah, I guess I can start. I suppose it is just really, what Descartes is doing is he is just working through his intuitions, right? He's sort of just thinking really hard. He's just reflecting really hard on what it is that thinking is, and I suppose that's where he gets to. I think he would agree that it's universal. If you do, all you need to do is reflect on those ideas enough, and you'll get to the truth, in his opinion, that the mind is something that is not simply the brain, that is something distinct from the body. But as to the adaptive question, I guess, Tim.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'd want to ask a proper social anthropologist whether it's really true that mind-body dualism is quite so universal. I mean, obviously Descartes thinks it's true, and therefore thinks everybody else ought to think the same thing as well. But whether everybody really does think that, I'm not sure. I mean, my kind of vague understanding of some social anthropological work on how non-European cultures conceive of the mind suggests maybe not everybody thinks of it in that way. I think it would be hard to obviously think of an adaptive rationale for mind-body dualism. I mean, it's not clear why you survive better if you think the mind and body are distinct than you would survive if instead you think there's some kind of complicated union, or if ultimately you think that it's just the body expressing itself in particular kinds of ways. I mean, in fact, you might in some ways think that would be a better way of doing things, because it might lead to kind of more consistent engagement with the environment, particularly if thought is sort of distributed throughout the body in the ways that Adrian's kind of already drawn attention to, or at least the way that some cognitive scientists like to think about these things.
There can also be use in the in the abstraction from the kind of physical details of thinking about whatever it is that is making up the mind. So we can explain each other's behavior using psychological terms like beliefs and desires, or thinking of each other as persons, which is it's a combined, it's kind of very obvious physical entities like human beings with these sorts of psychological capacities to see things or to touch things, but also to want things and to act in various ways that would bring about those desires. And there's no tension seemingly created by that kind of way of talking about others as having these sorts of mental states and processes. It's not obviously in tension with them being physical states and processes, but it picks out patterns that are very, very useful for communication and for engagement with one another. So
yeah, maybe I should also say that there have been plenty of people who've suggested adaptive rationales for, if you like, having a rich internal life. So Karl Popper's very well known for saying, look, here's one way you can adapt. If you're thinking straight, you survive, and if you make a mistake, you die. Here's another way in which you can adapt. You effectively construct an internal simulation of what the world's like and what your views are, and you test those out against each other. So you effectively, going back to the virtual reality idea, you kind of construct your own virtual reality in your own head in order to try out your ideas in a way that may allow you to learn and experiment without all the death needing to happen. And you can see that could have survival value.
Yes.
The ability to kind of run internal simulations rather than actually have to try the thing out in real life. And maybe it's a kind of side effect of having a rich internal mental life like that at all, that you start to think of yourself as essentially a mental thing.
Yeah, and following a similar line of thoughts, what you would get from these rich internal simulations are predictions about what what's the likely cause of what it is that you're seeing, or what are the likely effects of something that you intend to do, and you might bootstrap that very same process and come up with some really fundamental cause yourself as the cause of your thoughts and the cause of this kind of intermingling of all of these sensory events and actions in the world. And so maybe there's a lot to it.
Plenty. Okay, so I have what I think is maybe a pointed question from, treasured physics-friendly friend of the forum, Alex Franklin. So one might think that Einstein's relativity made sense of the matter-gravity relation. So do the panelists think that the mind-brain relation is still awaiting analogous transformative discoveries? It's a good one, I think. A hard one. Anyone want to take a bite?
That is a good one. That's a hard one. I guess. So I guess for Descartes anyway, given his sort of the framework that he's working within, discovering more and more in science, so sort of in neuroscience perhaps, discovering more and more about the brain isn't going to help, because that's just sort of one domain of explanation. As Adrian said, I thought that was very Cartesian. This idea that there are just sort of these different types of explanation that we can have. I suppose I'm always drawn back to Descartes' answer to Elizabeth, which is just sort of the mind-body union is something that you experience. When you stub your toe, it hurts. that's it. Sort of that's the explanation, and that's the best you're going to get. You're not going to have the kind of robust metaphysical explanation that you have in about other questions. You're not going to have the kind of robust scientific understanding that you have about other questions. Indeed, sort of religious explanation is a different category altogether as well. So there are these just sort of different kinds of explanation. There are different ways of knowing things, and I suppose his answer to her was just sort of like, well, you know, we do understand it because it's something we experience all the time. So what's the problem? Yeah,
it sounds like we might have found the rationalist brute fact finally.
I suppose, yeah, I guess that's sort of it.
Okay, this is a lovely question, I think, from Ian. So Adrian has interestingly brought up the metaphor of mind as an information processing machine. Could Lauren and Tim talk a little about other metaphors of mind that have been influential? Thanks, great discussion. And obviously, Adrian, if you've any to add, please do.
Just to add a small thing on the last question, but there is a relationship between the mind and the brain. That is really a very interesting empirical discovery, right? I mean, it wasn't obvious to Aristotle, for example, that there was a relationship between the mind and the brain. More obvious to Descartes, and you know, it could be that we kind of cracked open the skull and didn't really find anything going on. So, but that's the most I would say on that. But yeah, metaphors of mind. Maybe we need a biological metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of get what's sometimes referred to as a series of hydraulic metaphors in Darwin. So, and this is actually, I mean, I mentioned in a way that I didn't really explain at all that you don't get a lot of natural selection explanations going on in the expression of emotions. So, you know, Darwin says, you know, why do we tremble when we're scared? And really, all he says is, well, you know, being scared is a very sort of turbulent experience. It's a little bit like saying, why do engines vibrate when they're revved very hard? It's just what happens when you've got a lot of nerve fluid zooming around the nervous system very, very fast. You know, you're going to get this kind of juddering effect, basically. So you do get these. You know, in some ways quite charming sort of kind of hydraulic type metaphors cropping up on occasions. And yeah, I mean, generally, I think it's pretty kind of well observed that people reach for whatever the voguish type of tech is at any moment in history when they want to try to explain the mind. So now it's all deep neural networks, you know, at various points it's clocks. Sometimes it's hydraulic water systems.
Yeah, on that, I guess the tech of Descartes' time was very much the kind of clockwork, you know, automata, moving statues. When you sort of step on one pressure point, something moves, and so that's something that he uses to talk about bodies, but not so much minds. So yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything he says off the top of my head about some, you know, a metaphor to explain the mind. But that point about tech of the day being used as a tool of explanation is something that's true for Descartes as well, very much so.
There's definitely a nice chicken and egg kind of musing to be done about the sort of direction of influence between theories of mind and then hot tech. So I have a question here from Lois. So she says, thanks, Adrian, for pointing out a possibility that we may see our mind as part of a system or our surrounding. How can we possibly empirically test the hypothesis?
Well, so by making it slightly more specific, for one thing. So if, say, you make it more specific by saying that internal memory systems exploit stability in the relationships between structures in the body, or the relationship between objects in the environment, in order to minimize the amount of information stored within neural structures, then messing with that stability in various ways would allow you to test that hypothesis. So in not a very experimental setting, I might just rearrange everything in your hallway so that the place where you normally put your keys is somewhere very, very different. Or maybe just slightly different, just different enough that for the next few days, you have to really think about where you put your keys. And it might slow you down. You might make more mistakes. Right? So there's a perhaps more intuitive example.
Can I ask Adrian actually on that point? Because it always seems to me that there are kind of more and less radical ways of interpreting those kinds of results, right? So there's this work showing that cocktail waiters really need to place the glasses in just the right place and have all the bottles arranged in just the right kind of way in order to be able to do their mixing as quickly as they want to and get the right drinks in the right place. And there's one reading of that which just says, if you think they're remembering everything in their head, they're not. It's also very important the glassware is arranged properly. Yeah. There's another reading which seems to suggest some of the thinking is actually going on in the glassware, right? And the first one doesn't seem to obviously lead you to the second one, but some of those claims about cognition being out there in the world seem to invite those much stronger readings. And I just don't know, I'm interested to know where you stand on that.
Where I stand on that? I think that all you need really is one case to make the principle, right? But it doesn't look like there's anything that's going to be a good enough case to persuade everybody of that principle, that that the mind literally extends out to include the environment. But there are lots of ways in which people have attacked this idea. So one way is to think of it as a matter of just being consistent in how we talk about these processes. So if it's something that you would say is psychological, if it goes on inside the head, then you ought to say the same for it being outside the head. Another way in which people have attacked it is to say that that what you need in order to deny that it goes, that the mind extends beyond the head, is to find some principal point of interface between the mind and the rest of the world. And it's actually really difficult to find that when you look at how deep the flows of information transfer are. And yet another way is to look at how all of our psychological capacities fit together and think about how, for example, our ability to think about the world depends upon our ability to perceptually engage with the world, and that when we're perceptually engaging with the world, it's just the very things that are there that are a part of our experience. And so this suggests that thinking about everything psychological as something within the brain is mistaken, at least to some. It's heavily debated. I mean, each of those those lines of thought.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
This theme is kind of relevant to the next question. So I'm going to ask you guys to weigh in on something that has proved to be this most surprisingly controversial topic of contemporary philosophy. So panpsychism. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts about the idea that everything has a mind or is minded, that some form of consciousness, however minimal, is universal? So.
It's a powerful idea that promises to solve a certain kind of problem by appeal to what seems to be a really compelling fact, right? That we can be acquainted with something really, really basic about our mind, our current conscious experience, and that has to be, what we're presented with in that case has to be a part of any explanation of the mind, and that we can conceive of the physical world as being absent of that really, really compelling to some people anyway, phenomenological property, seems to be inconsistent with this compelling intuition. So a way of solving the problem is to put together the physicality with the phenomenality in such a way that panpsychists do. But really do not take me as presenting a kind of sympathetic version of their view. They would, panpsychists would probably put the point much better.
Oh, well, if philosophy Twitter is anything to go by, you were very brave in just offering some kind of an answer to this theme.
Yeah,
so,
I was constantly trying to hedge whilst thinking it through because of the Twitter storm that it might
provoke.
I don't,
okay, so
know, I don't know about the Twitter storm. Maybe I can just weigh in an insouciant manner. But I mean, I hinted that for Darwin, he does kind of flirt with something that sounds a lot like panpsychism, actually. So, you know, in this suggestion that you should think of the roots of plants as having a kind of mentality. It's worth noticing, though, that that's partly in service of a very specific concern for Darwin, though, right? And that concern is just this wish to suggest that you don't get completely special properties emerging in one species all by itself. You should expect these things to be distributed. So it's kind of good news then for Darwin if he can show that to some degree or another mentality is present right through the plant and animal kingdoms. So that means that, I mean, without wishing to comment on whether these views are any good or not, that means that for Darwin, first of all, there's no sort of explanatory requirement on his part to suggest that everything has a form of mentality. It's just important for him to suggest the living stuff has a form of mentality. And also, it's not really solving anything like the mind-body problem either. I mean, if you're puzzled as to how on earth anything gets to think at all, saying that, well, all the plants and animals do doesn't answer that question. Saying all the plants and animals do it is just a good way of suggesting this kind of evolutionary unity. But it doesn't really get any traction in Darwin's version, at least, for, you know, what's called the hard problem or anything like that.
Okay, thank you. One sort of, I suppose, last question, because we're sort of running down on time, from Philippa. So quite a philosophical question now. So what was the impact, if any, of Gilbert Ryle's thesis in The Concept of Mind, arguing against Descartes' mind-body dualism on current ideas of the mind? And then she also thanks us for such a great discussion. But yeah, especially Lauren, I'm wondering, you know, the kind of the state of contemporary Cartesianism given kind of early 20th century criticisms.
Yeah. So I'll admit that my understanding of Ryle is probably relatively basic. I know that he accuses Descartes of committing this category mistake. I mean, it does just seem to me to be a kind of big misunderstanding of what Descartes was trying to say. But I mean, in terms of the way that Descartes' view has been sort of pulled into more contemporary stuff, I do think there's a kind of tendency to bring up his name in reference to a kind of caricature that is often unhelpful, and that people sort of, you know, identify as being something that's bad. You know, people talk about this kind of Cartesian hangover where we get all our bad ideas about mental health issues, or about sort of gender and race issues, and also animal ethics, for some of the reasons that we've already talked about. I mean, I do think that that sort of, well, it's sort of irresponsible when philosophers do it. I think we owe it to actually work out what the position was, and sort of take it seriously as such. And I do think that in fact, on things like mental health, as we've already sort of said, but this was a topic that Descartes was sort of very interested in. It's something that he talks about a lot, especially to Elizabeth, and the Passions of the Soul, which is the last work that he wrote. I think, you know, could plausibly be seen as a work that is relevant to mental health. So that perhaps that was sort of slightly tangential, but I do think we owe it to Descartes to try and understand him and try and understand the position, so that we don't end up with a kind of gross caricature of substance dualism that's sort of immediately shot down. Yeah.
Oh, I think it's a nice note to end on as well, that, you know, these themes that seem sometimes to have been completely ignored early on are not always so lamentably addressed by some of the people involved. So I wish I could have gotten to more of the questions. There are absolutely loads, so thank you so much for them. But that is it from us. So the forum are finished for the summer. So we will be back in the autumn term with lots more philosophy and other topics. But yeah, that's it from us for now. So it just remains to thank our speakers. So speakers, I'm extremely grateful to you guys for coming. And thank you very much to the audience. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully see you at another event like this soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.